newspapers that are like the Daily News in New York. And he was able to synchronize his flash with a lot of spontaneous situations. That is to say, he saw that something was going to happen that had a kind of symbolic significance, and then he would pin it like a butterfly in a butterfly collection by using the flash to pin it down. And he was the first photographer who did that in that extraordinary way, and the work remains unique. Nobody has ever quite either duplicated or been able to exceed what he did with flash photography.
Off to the female side, this female photographer you know pretty well, Vivian Maier. What made her work really captivate the world?
Well, she's a very paradoxical addition to the history of photography, because part of what made her photography great was its privacy, was the fact that she didn't share it with other people, the fact that it was sort of her secret life. She talked to people about it, and she occasionally showed people she worked for. At one point, she worked for a man who was, I think, a dentist. She worked as a nanny. As you know, she spent her whole professional life was taking care of well-to-do people's children. And one of them, I think he was a dentist, was an amateur photographer, and it was the one time she had access to a darkroom and could process her own work. And she showed him her work, and she showed some of her friends her work, but she was actually very secretive about it. When the book that I did on her work was the last body of work that had not been explored, which was her slides. Starting in the 1970s, she shot slides. She usually took them to the drugstore, basically, to have them processed. And in many instances, she had never even seen them. She'd never even opened the box. The major contribution that I made to her story as a photographer, as a street photographer, is that in order to write that essay and get the pictures that they needed to publish that book on the color slides she'd done, I had to look at over 140,000 slides and pick 100. And most of the slides, in fact, I would say the vast majority of the slides I looked at, no one, including her, had ever seen before.
Wow.
I mean, what they did for me, of course, was to scan them all and send me them on a hard drive. If I'd had to open the boxes and look at them on a light table, I would have gone mad.
What made her photographs really stand out?
Partly, I think, again, like Winogrand, Winogrand had a unique and very aggressive personality. Vivian Maier had a unique and very secretive personality. She spent her whole life living in other people's homes and tending to their children and putting on, acting accordingly as basically a kind of servant of wealthy people. But what allowed her, I think, to have the even keel to live that sort of life was that she led this other sort of life as a photographer, that she took in many instances wild and crazy pictures. Finding 100 that were really great there was other pictures that I could have included in her pantheon, but there's a lot of wasted energy when you look at 140,000 pictures by one photographer. And so the fact that she was blasting away in some ways limited her perceptions, and the fact that she didn't, that she collected the stuff for herself but didn't really show it to anyone. She didn't get an interaction, a public response, a critique of the work. And as a result, in some ways, as a result of that, she developed in unique ways, but in some ways very limited in her vision.
Talk about Diane Arbus's
Diane Arbus was actually in some ways like Vivian Maier in that although she was a very public figure, she and her husband Alan had been professional photographers for fashion and things like that and celebrity portraiture before, or even when she was already doing street photography. And again, it was a personality, a human character driven by a certain idea of life in these times, of life in America at that point in history, that drove her out to the street and drove her to seek out certain kinds of subjects. And you know, seeing the craziness of life, which is what street photography often does, and the ability to see the craziness of life in a way that allows you to document it with that amount of acuity is a heavy burden. It's not just a coincidence that this photographer killed herself.
Carrie Boris?
Who?
Carrie Boris, New York City street photographer.
Oh, yeah, I think I looked at a little of her work. I don't really have a response to it. Who? Meryl? Is she one of the ones you sent me to?
Yeah, New York City. No. Helen Levitt.
Who? Helen Levitt? Yeah. Helen Levitt Helen Levitt was in many ways like Arbus, in that she saw the kind of, especially among children, the kind of craziness and unexpected, the spontaneity of children. But she was someone who was much more settled in her life. She photographed over a long period of time, and she was also a wonderful colleague and a very encouraging colleague and a helpful colleague to many photographers of her time, most especially Walker Evans. She traveled with Evans when he did all those subway portraits that are, I think, arguably his greatest body of work ever. And her support and her feedback and her involvement with him not only brought attention to her photography that she deserved as a photographer, but it also fed him in a way that was crucial to that development in his career. So she's in some ways, her pictures are in some ways comparable to the Arbus work, especially of children, but the personality was very different. She lived a long and I believe very happy, very satisfied life, whereas Arbus was edgy in ways that had to do with her personal life. Nothing, you know, it wasn't, photography couldn't compensate her for some of the crazy things that happened to her in her marriage and things like that. She was much more susceptible. Bernice Abbott, in some ways like Levitt, in that she was a woman, and because she was a woman, she had more trouble than Arbus ever did to get her work paid attention to. She did the history of photography an incredible service when a very little known French documentary photographer died, and she rescued, his name was Eugene Auger, and she rescued his archive. He had a little studio in a part of Paris near where she lived, and she'd gotten to know him and considered him a genius. He sold documentary photographs to various markets, but after he died, he had no heirs, and they were going to throw away his archive. And she rescued it, she brought it back to America, and she eventually, it was acquired by the Museum of Modern Art, which did 4 Auger shows and really put him on the map. And that was all thanks to her. And she had that kind of relationship with a number of photographers. She was very generous of spirit. Her photography shows that, especially her photography of architecture and things like that. And she did do street photography as well, and was a crucial presence and even an influence in the period from the 1930s through the 1960s.
How would you describe her type of street photograph?
Well, again, they're not staged, but they're slow motion, most of them. She's not,